Well, it's been 30 days since Donald Trump signed a bill into law requiring the Justice Department to, quote, release all documents and records in possession of the Department of Justice relating to Jeffrey Epstein, end quote. All documents and records. But this morning on Fox, Donald Trump's former criminal defense lawyer and now the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Todd Blanche, announced that the Trump administration would be violating the Epstein Files Transparency Act.
I expect that we're going to release more documents over the next couple of weeks. So today, several 100,000. And then over the next couple of weeks, I expect several 100,000 more.
Hours later, the Trump Justice Department released some, not all of its files on Epstein. And today, our next guest, the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, Jamie Raskin, released a joint statement with the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, Robert Garcia, saying, quote, Donald Trump and the Department of Justice are now violating federal law as they continue covering up the facts and the evidence about Jeffrey Epstein's decades-long billion-dollar international sex trafficking ring. For months, Pam Bondi has denied survivors the transparency and accountability they have demanded and deserve and have defied the Oversight Committee's subpoena. The the Department of Justice is now making it clear that it intends to defy Congress itself, even as it gives star treatment to Epstein's convicted co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell. Courts around the country have repeatedly intervened when this administration has broken the law. We are now examining all legal options in the face of this violation of federal law. The survivors of this nightmare deserve justice. The co-conspirators must be held accountable, and the American people deserve complete transparency from DOJ. The Justice Department posted 3,965 files on a page titled Epstein Library on the Justice Department's website. In a letter obtained by MS Now, Todd Blanche writes to members of Congress, quote, this process resulted in over 1,200 names being identified as victims or their relatives. We have redacted reference to such names. In addition to redacting the names of these victims, we have also redacted and are not producing any materials that could result in their identification. One of the files released includes 119 pages of grand jury testimony titled Grand Jury New York that is completely redacted. Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna, who along with Republican Congressman Thomas Massie led the effort to force a vote on the bill that is now law. Today, Congressman Khanna said this.
They released one document from a New York grand jury of 119 pages, totally blacked out. This despite a federal judge ordering them to release that document. And our law requires them to explain redactions. It is an incomplete release with too many redactions. Thomas Massie and I are exploring all options. It can be the impeachment of people at justice, inherent contempt, or referring for prosecution those who are obstructing justice. We will work with the survivors to demand the full release of these files, to demand justice for the Epstein class and accountability.
Congressman Massie wrote in response, quote, unfortunately, today's document released by Attorney General Pam Bondi and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche grossly fails to comply with both the spirit and the letter of the law that Donald Trump signed just 30 days ago. Representative Ro Khanna is correct. The New York Times reports that Donald Trump's name is, quote, rarely mentioned in the batch of Jeffrey Epstein files that his Justice Department released on Friday, based on a preliminary New York Times scan of thousands of documents and hundreds of photographs. The files that the Times initially reviewed on Friday include scattered references to or images of Mr. Trump. Most of the photos were already public, including shots of him and Melania Trump with Mr. Epstein and Mr. Epstein's longtime associate, Ghislaine Maxwell. Written references to Mr. Trump came up in Mr. Epstein's address book and flight logs, as well as a message book in which Mr. Epstein's assistants let him know about missed phone calls. Versions of those documents were already public. Jeffrey Epstein has said on tape that he was, quote, Donald Trump's closest friend for 10 years. Last month, Donald Trump tried to downplay that friendship.
I have nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein. I threw him out of my club many years ago because I thought he was a sick pervert.
But in a New York Times article titled Don's Best Friend, How Epstein and Trump Bonded Over the Pursuit of Women, the New York Times reports, quote, an examination of their history by the New York Times has found no evidence implicating Mr. Trump in Mr. Epstein's abuse and trafficking of minors, But the two men's relationship was both far closer and far more complex than the president now admits. Beginning in the late 1980s, the two men forged a bond intense enough to leave others who knew them with the impression that they were each other's closest friend. The Times found neither man drank or did drugs. They pursued women in a game of ego and dominance. Female bodies were currency. With other men, Mr. Epstein might discuss tax shelters, international affairs, or neuroscience. With Mr. Trump, he talked about sex. The Times reports, quote, one of the women who has never before spoken publicly about the experience told the Times that Mr. Epstein had coerced her into attending 4 parties at Mr. Epstein's home. Mr. Trump attended all 4, the woman said. At 2 of them, she said, Mr. Epstein directed her to have sex with other male guests. Tina Davis, who worked with Ford models in the mid-1990s, attended a party at Mar-a-Lago when she was just 14. The Times reports, quote, she was told to dress sexy, according to her mother, Sandra Coleman, who had accompanied her to Florida. 8 or 9 other models came along on the bus. All the girls were really young, Ms. Coleman recalled in an interview. Some of them could have been in training bras. When they arrived at Mar-a-Lago, Ms. Coleman said, her daughter was promptly handed a glass of champagne. She took it away, but waiters kept offering more. Each time one of the middle-aged men at the party approached her daughter, Ms. Coleman would walk over and introduce herself as Ms. Davis's mother. During a trip to the bathroom, they ran into Mr. Trump's new wife, whom they had met earlier. Ms. Maples clasped her hands, Ms. Coleman recalled, and looked her in the eye. Whatever you do, do not let her around any of these men, and especially my husband, end quote, she told Ms. Coleman. Protect her, Ms. Maples denied making that comment. The Times found no evidence that Trump was involved in any wrongdoing. Chris Whipple writes in Vanity Fair that Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, quote, read what she calls the Epstein file, and she said Trump is in the file. And we know he's in the file, and he's not in the file doing anything awful. Wiles said that Trump was on Epstein's plane. He's on the manifest. They were, sort of young, single, whatever. I know it's a passé word, but sort of young, single playboys together, end quote. While Trump has yet to comment on today's release, the White House has, and in a statement they called the Trump administration the, quote, most transparent in history. Today, Jess Michaels, who's a survivor of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse, said this.
I'm also feeling strangely validated because in plain sight and even with an act of Congress, we're seeing the exact same delays, negligence, corruption, incompetence that we've seen consistently and have been advocating about. And so they've actually proved our point.
We've actually proved our point. Leading up our discussion tonight is the Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. He's the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
You bet. Delighted.
Congressman, let's talk about what is possibly going on here. First of all, it's a very small portion of the documents that have been released, and the redactions, I don't know, what's the implication? That everything that's redacted has to do with names and identification of victims, or is there more to it than that?
Well, undoubtedly, there's more to it than that. I mean, I've not been able to go through everything, but what I've seen looks like my weekly recycling pile, except
Right.
heavily redacted, in some places absolutely redacted. But the point that this survivor and all the survivors have been making is absolutely right. I mean, this is a huge tug of war over whether there will be truth and justice and accountability for the predators here. Look, I think that New York Times article makes clear to anybody who hasn't already been convinced of it that these were scenes of absolute predatory bacchanalia and exploitation of women and girls. And the question is now, what will the government do about it? And we saw how Donald Trump just switched sides at the last minute to say, oh, yeah, everybody vote for this, figuring that they would proceed to sandbag and undermine the disclosure, which they have done. Everything was
Right.
supposed to be released today. And, you know, back in July, they told us there was nothing left to see there. And in September, Kash Patel testified before our committee, and he said, yeah, we didn't find any potential evidence of any other crimes, which means they've already been through it. And now suddenly they're postponing and, you know, they're prevaricating and, you know, making up excuses all the way. So it's going to be a fight to get this stuff out and to see justice for the survivors who have been very much driving this train, and also to see accountability for whatever other criminals are out there, people who cooperated with Ghislaine Maxwell and with Jeffrey Epstein.
So I can't see what the upside is for Kash Patel and Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche to be involved in this. It seems that Dan Bongino has made a decision that he's not going to stick around the FBI because he doesn't feel like being involved in this. They don't have the same protections that the President of the United States has. What Ro Khanna was talking about, things can be pursued, you know, of them if they are not telling the truth.
Well, that's true, except that, you know, Donald Trump is passing out pardons like Christmas cookies right now. So if you're in for a dime, you're in for a dollar. At this point, given how much they've gone along as accomplices in this cover-up, they figure they're better off just doing whatever Donald Trump tells them to do, so that there might be, you know, a pardon waiting somewhere over the rainbow for them. So I think, you know, they're going to continue to stick around. Others like Bongino are like members of a religious cult who wake up on the basement floor one day and say to themselves, somewhere I took a wrong turn and now look where my life is, and they're trying to get out as quickly as they can.
So someone who's looking at a pardon or a commutation very soon is Ghislaine Maxwell. She seems to be the most kinetic character in this whole thing. She's moving forward with trying to get better treatment than she's already got by being moved to a sort of a prison camp. What do you make of how that situation fits into all of this?
Well, this is really the only thing about the whole affair that is remotely transparent, because we can see exactly what's going on. She got subpoenaed on one day by the House Oversight Committee, and the very next day, she hears from Todd Blanche, who had been Donald Trump's private criminal defense lawyer, who had gone over to Department of Justice, who was conveniently assigned to be overseeing all this stuff as the number 2 person there. He goes to see Ghislaine Maxwell. Not to try to find out who are the other co-conspirators, who are the other accomplices, what crimes have yet to come to light that we should be involved in. No, he goes simply to find out what will she say about Donald Trump, and pronouncing himself satisfied. And remember, he got rid of the real lawyers in the case, and but pronouncing himself satisfied with her answers, then suddenly she gets this very sweetheart deal where she goes off to this minimum security camp, and even there is given the 5-star Trump hotel treatment with room service and ability to work out whenever she wants, guests who can come and bring computers. The warden is sending messages back and forth to the people she wants to correspond with. It's unbelievable. And they don't even deny that. They just fire the people who they think brought this forward as whistleblowers.
It's truly remarkable. Congressman, good to have you here. Thank you for joining us, as always, Congressman Jamie Raskin. Joining us now is MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin. Don't envy the day you've had, because you have no choice. You can't sit there and say, wow, 4,000 documents, thousands of pages, probably nothing all that interesting in here, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. You had to pay attention to it. Tell me what you found.
I found a lot that was not very interesting, to be perfectly honest with you. And that is perhaps the most newsworthy development of all, is that there isn't much here that we didn't already know. I will tell you that I found a number of redactions that you can't possibly explain by the redactions that are available to the Department of Justice. So for example, they are not supposed to, under the terms of the act, redact the names or likenesses of people just because it would cause them reputational harm or it would be embarrassing to them. And that includes people who are government officials, public figures, or even foreign dignitaries. And yet, there are documents here that reference certain people like Sandy Berger, the former Clinton National Security Advisor, and redact the names of other men who leave Jeffrey Epstein messages, for example, or we can see photographs in which male faces are clearly redacted, and we don't have any context or explanation for that. The other thing that I find really interesting about today comes from a letter that Todd Blanche sent members of Congress accompanying the production. And I want to read a little bit of it to you because essentially Mr. Blanche is justifying why he and his department didn't comply with the letter of the act, which required the production within 30 days or not later than 30 days after the enactment of the act. He says that the department's decision essentially to produce rolling productions is consistent with federal case law that says that statutes should not be interpreted to require the impossible. And here I have to ask, what exactly was impossible about the task that was put upon the Department of Justice? I understand that the timeline here was abbreviated, but if you look at public reporting spanning this entire year, from roughly about February on, when the Trump administration first came in, they were making pledges to release the Epstein files. Pam Bondi famously
She
said
said on
had signed
TV,
this.
they're on my desk.
Correct. And we also know from the Wall Street Journal, from the New York Times, that there were successive reviews upon reviews by people at the FBI and the Department of Justice in order to roll out productions of the so-called Epstein files consistent with what the administration's pledge had been. So my question to Mr. Blanche is, this didn't come from nowhere. This is in response to a review and production that your own department said it would make. I recognize that the requirements of the act perhaps are different than the requirements that they were imposing on themselves as part of that review. But it's not as if they're starting from scratch. And the idea that this was an impossible task for the Department of Justice, I had a friend say to me today, you honestly think that if a federal court or a law required a company to produce documents within 24 hours,
That they could try
law
this.
firms wouldn't move heaven and earth to make that happen? Of course not. They would. But this Department of Justice seems to think the law doesn't apply to it.
Yeah, that's perhaps the clearest message from today's partial release of the files. Lisa, as always, thank you for being with us and for your clear-eyed analysis. Lisa Rubin, MS Now legal analyst. All right, coming up, Donald Trump is taking his case that Americans shouldn't believe their lying eyes about high prices to North Carolina tonight. I'm going to ask the former governor, Roy Cooper, how that's going over with voters. That's next. A couple nights ago, Donald Trump delivered a very loud primetime address to America in which he hurled lies and falsehoods to gaslight us all into believing the strength of the U.S. economy that he has created. Tonight, Donald Trump decided to run it back at a rally in North Carolina.
We're here tonight to celebrate 11 incredible months. It's been the most successful first year of any president in the history of our country. Yesterday, it was announced that inflation is far lower than anybody expected. I told you. That's despite taking in billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs. Remember they said, oh, the tariffs will cause inflation. Just came out with the best inflation report we've had in years. And lots of cash, too.
Wow. By the way, not a word about the Epstein files. But most Americans are not buying what Donald Trump is trying to sell them as it relates to the economy. Reuters reports with some prices increasing and unemployment up, Trump has his work cut out for him. A Reuters Ipsos poll released on Tuesday showed just 33% of U.S. adults approve of how Donald Trump has handled the economy. Similarly, NPR reports this week an NPR PBS News Marist poll found that only 36% of voters approve of Trump's handling of the economy, the lowest mark since the poll started asking that question 6 years ago. The article goes on to say other recent polls have shown that Trump is losing popularity with voters in North Carolina, a state he's won in 3 consecutive presidential elections. A late November poll from High Point University found that about 60% of North Carolina voters surveyed disapprove of how Trump is addressing inflation, while 52% disapprove of his tariff policies. The Associated Press went even further and profiled how folks in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, the town Donald Trump visited tonight, view the economy. Ahead of President Donald Trump's Friday evening visit to Rocky Mount, some residents say that they're feeling an economic squeeze that seems hard to escape. The uneasy feeling spans political affiliation in the town, which is split largely between 2 rural and somewhat impoverished counties. Rocky Mount may be in a politically advantageous location, But the hardships its residents report mirror the tightening financial strains many Americans say they are feeling, with high prices for groceries, housing, and utilities among their top concerns. One of the reasons Donald Trump was in Rocky Mount tonight was to campaign for the Republican U.S. Senate candidate, Michael Whatley. The former chairman of the Republican National Committee is the frontrunner to win the GOP nomination in one of the most closely watched Senate races of the 2026 midterms. His Democratic opponent will likely be the former North Carolina governor, Roy Cooper, who holds an 8-point advantage in recent polling. Joining us now is the former governor, Roy Cooper. He's a candidate for the United States Senate in North Carolina. Governor, great to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Glad to join you tonight, Ollie.
So, worth pointing out, Donald Trump has won North Carolina as a presidential candidate, but you've won North Carolina as a governor a few times, and that's what happens in North Carolina. It's close to the edge. People want candidates who speak to what they are feeling and what they're thinking, and you can't really lie to people about the economy.
You're right about that. Michael Whatley, my opponent, has brought his merry band of fellow Washington, D.C. insiders here to try to tell North Carolinians that their prices are lower, their wages are higher, and that this is the greatest economy ever. Most people aren't buying it because they just simply can't afford it. All you got to do, you don't have to go very far to talk with people. The rent is too high. Utilities are too high. Groceries are too high. They're struggling with childcare. And this big, beautiful bill has put many people with health care at risk. We just got 700,000 people Medicaid expansion in North Carolina, and they're struggling right now. I went to a small business just the other day to shop for Christmas, and she showed me the tariff surcharge that she was having to eat part of it and charge the rest of it to the people who've come to her store. This is not right. We need change in Washington. I'm ready to win this Senate seat and go help.
So it's interesting because Donald Trump said a little bit tonight of what he said the other night, which was weird, right? An address by the president from the White House is usually kept for moments of national tragedy or unity or announcing a war or something. He was just sort of kind of yelling at people about the economy. And he keeps saying, the other day he said the economy, he was asked to grade it and he gave it an A++++, 5 pluses there. I suppose for some people it is an A+++++ economy, right? If you're fairly wealthy and you make your money off of money and your taxes are low and you don't have to worry about health care and you don't have to worry about the price of eggs, it's a great economy. And for the rest of America, it's not.
The billionaires made out like bandits with the big, beautiful bill, but everybody else is struggling. And Michael Whatley, my opponent, is continuing to parrot the president. He continues talking about how grocery prices are lower. And the people of North Carolina know that that is not true. So what we need to do is to make sure we win this race, bring the checks and balances back to our federal government. North Carolina is the #1 flip seat in the country. We can flip this seat from red to blue. We have to do it in order to take back the Senate majority. People can go to roycooper.com, learn about our campaign, and help us out because, Ollie, they're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars here trying to convince the people of North Carolina that I am someone I am not. The people of North Carolina know me, but when you spend hundreds of millions of dollars, it makes it tougher. But we're going to be ready because we know how important this seat is to everyday people who are struggling right now. Tom Tillis, the Republican who is there now, stood up and said, I'm not going to vote for this big, beautiful bill because I don't know what to tell my constituents in North Carolina. He knew that close to 1 million of them might lose their health insurance, and we can't have that.
North Carolina is not a deeply ideological place. It's heavily gerrymandered, but it's not deeply ideological. But what's interesting is that in Virginia and New York City and in New Jersey a month ago, what we saw in the elections was remarkable, and that is that whatever your ideology actually is, it takes second place to your safety, your health care, your cost of living. If people believe that Roy Cooper has an answer for them, and it sounds like it's genuine, and the advantage, of course, is that you were a governor, so you know a thing or two about how this works, they are likely to support you regardless of whether they voted for Donald Trump or not last time.
Well, that's right. I mean, there were a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump and me at the same time on the same ballot. Now, I don't want to try to explain that, but I've had Republicans tell me that they don't agree with everything that I do and say, but they believe I'm doing what I think is right for the people of North Carolina. And that's what they want. They want a problem solver. Look, we put a bipartisan coalition together to get a Republican legislature to pass Medicaid expansion. That's something that other southern states haven't been able to do, but we've been able to do it. And that's what I want to do. I want to go to Washington to be a problem solver, to work across the aisle when I can, work with the president when I can, but certainly stand up to him when I need to. And my opponent, Michael Whatley, will simply be an acolyte for the president. He'll be a yes man. The people of North Carolina don't want that. They want a strong, independent senator who can work with the president when he can, stand up to him when he needs to. And that's what I'm going to bring to the people of this state.
Governor, good to see you. Thanks for spending time with us this evening. Governor Roy Cooper, Democratic candidate for the Senate in North Carolina. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks a bunch.
All right, coming up, the bipartisan vote to force Donald Trump to release the Epstein files was just the beginning. Marjorie Taylor Greene says the dam is breaking with Republican support for Trump, and there's more evidence tonight that Mike Johnson's job could get a lot harder in January. That's next. On Capitol Hill, Republican Speaker Mike Johnson continues to insist that he's got firm control of his caucus. The evidence says otherwise. As Politico reports, time and again this year, the Democrats under Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries have maneuvered to successfully undercut the GOP agenda and put its leaders on the back foot. From a daily drumbeat on health care to the long-running saga over the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein to a new focus on the rising cost of living, they believe they're succeeding by making the party in power talk about Democratic priorities, not its own. Their success was underscored this week when 4 House Republicans joined a Jeffries-led effort to force a vote on expiring Obamacare insurance subsidies, a major embarrassment for the GOP speaker. Democrats, Jeffries said, have already won more discharge petitions in the last 3 weeks than have been successful in the last 30 years. More could be coming next year, with more lawmakers planning to move on Russia sanctions legislation and a ban on congressional stock trading. And the pressure is only increasing as Johnson tries to avoid another government shutdown before funding runs out at the end of January. Retiring Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene said more Republicans are preparing to break from Trump.
Just last week, and I think the dam is breaking. Many Republicans may not have called him out, but last week 13 Republicans voted with Democrats to overturn one of President Trump's executive orders, which enabled him to fire federal workers. We also saw Indiana Republicans vote against redistricting. That is a sign where you're seeing Republicans, they're entering the campaign phase for 2026, which is a large signal that lame duck season has begun and that Republicans will go in all in for themselves in order to save their own reelections.
You think the dam is breaking in terms of the president's iron grip of support when it comes to your party?
Absolutely.
Well, the cracks in the dam are clearly showing with the number of Republicans who have already announced that they aren't seeking re-election or are on the fence. Notice reports 43 representatives have said they won't run for re-election in 2026. And so far, the Republicans' 24 retirements are outpacing the Democrats' 19. Rumors are swirling around Capitol Hill about an impending mass exodus of House Republicans following a number of surprise retirement announcements over the past few months. One of those Republicans not running in 2026 is Elise Stefanik. Stefanik announced today that she is ending her short-lived campaign for New York governor, where polls showed her nearly 20 points behind Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul, and she will not seek re-election for the House. Remember, Stefanik has borne the brunt of Trump's unpopularity for longer than others. She had her nomination to be UN ambassador withdrawn in March, 2 months after Trump took office, because Republicans were afraid of losing her House seat in a special election, even though she represents a safely Republican district. Lame duck season has officially begun for Donald Trump. Republican lawmakers are heading home to voters who've spent weeks watching Donald Trump and his party fall short on promises that he claimed he would solve on day one. Stubbornly high prices amid an affordability crisis that Donald Trump thinks is a hoax. Trump defiant on his price hiking tariffs, even as poll numbers bottom out. And politically, the warning signs are everywhere. The elections that the Democrats won in landslides in November, underperforming in districts that Trump carried comfortably in 2024. The midterm campaign is on. In 2026, Donald Trump's name won't be on the ballot, but for Republican lawmakers up for re-election, the consequences of his presidency absolutely are. Joining us now is the former Congressman David Jolly. He's running for governor in Florida, and MS Now legal analyst Melissa Murray. She's a professor of law at the New York University. Welcome to both of you. Great to see you both in person. Melissa, I want to start with Elise Stefanik because she has been a lightning rod, in some ways the way Marjorie Taylor Greene was. But I just want to remind everybody about who this person is. She led the attack on the women who ran some of America's finest universities. She did Donald Trump's dirty work, dirty bidding on that, and she's remarkably unpopular, in part as a result of that and in part as a result of who she actually is.
No, all of that is right. She was a MAGA midwife for sure. I think like many in her caucus, many of the women in her caucus, she may have figured out that the conservative movement may not always be the most hospitable place for forward-thinking women, regardless of what their positions are. And, I think she found herself in a situation where she was running against a relatively popular female governor, and she's up against a president who has long coattails, but they're dragging her down. Like, these aren't the kind of coattails you want to hang on to. So she's perhaps the first casualty of Trump's lame duck season. And I will say, this is a lame duck season that has come really early. Mm-hmm. Typically, we start talking about a lame duck presidency after the midterms.
Correct.
We're already here.
Yes.
And
there's a press conference after the midterms in which somebody's had a bad night the night before, and they start. You realize at the beginning, the presidential campaign has begun.
Right. They're already starting. They are on their marks. They're ready to go. And it seems a little bit like there's some internecine warfare within the Republican Party about who they're going to be, what they're going to look like after Donald Trump. And what is interesting is the way some of these women, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Elise Stefanik, she's receded, but Marjorie Taylor Greene is rebranding herself in real time, and we are all watching it. Yes.
Because we've never run long, interviews with Marjorie Taylor Greene other than to sort of say it's ridiculous, and she sounds unusually normal right now. But talk to me about this. You watched the internecine problems in the Republican Party in the past. Why is this an unusually early midterm lame duck cycle, and what's going on in the party?
Donald Trump's numbers are historically low. They're in the 30% range. Even Florida now in my race is a toss-up, which is something you would not have predicted a year ago. So if you are a Republican politician, you are wondering, is the marriage now worth it any longer? And I would also say, I say this very respectfully, look, members of Congress are not martyrs. They ask for the opportunity. It's an honor every single day, but it is a miserable job. Mm-hmm. It is a miserable job, growing more miserable by the day for several reasons. One, if you're a Republican in Congress, this is probably the greatest failure of a Congress in my lifetime. Speaker Johnson's probably the weakest Speaker of the House we have seen in generations. And so nothing is happening. You have no answers to the real anxiety of people, whether it is the economy or other challenges that they face. And you have a president that is fascinated by gilding his own presidency and enriching his own family, building ballrooms and naming the Kennedy Center after himself, which could not be more disconnected from the reality of your constituents.
That's the thing. And that's the thing, Melissa. It doesn't matter whether he's gilding his own fortune or his office, or he's naming these things after. If people are doing okay, they almost don't care what the politicians are doing or what Washington is doing. We're not doing okay, or a lot of people are not doing okay, and they're listening to him, including tonight, tell people in North Carolina that it is the greatest economy in the history of America. He's got all these superlatives that don't make sense to people who have to buy eggs and pay rent.
Well, I mean, there is the disjunction between the message on which they ran, which was about affordability, bringing prices down, and then everything that they have done.
Which is weird, because they won on that message.
It's a winning message, as we've seen. But it's not, the minute they're in office, there are these tariffs. And the tariffs, like, regardless of what you say, they're taxes. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that the prices of things are going up. The one thing I think he's going to be able to count on is that the Supreme Court is going to deliver a loss to him on the tariffs, which will be a win for everyone else, and maybe a win for a Republican Party, because it will save the party from Trump and these awful economic policies that the tariffs represent. But the core message, how can you be about affordability and then not want to have a vote on this question of healthcare premiums? Like, this is a basic kitchen table issue. If you're talking about affordability, you have to be talking about that too.
you talk about your race in Florida.
Yeah.
What we saw in last month's elections in New York City, in Virginia, and in New Jersey is people who we had believed had shifted away from the Democratic Party sort of permanently into being Republicans, including young men in New York, Hispanics. That applies to Florida because Florida has, in some people's mind, become a foregone conclusion. And what you're telling me is it's not looking like a foregone conclusion.
Florida's congressional special election swung by 15 and 16 points.
Right.
Our state legislative races by up to 21. The city of Miami just elected a Democratic mayor for the first time in 30 years by 18 or 19 points, where we saw Cuban males come back voting for a Democrat. I say this, Allie, very importantly. I've done about 140 town halls. We've been talking about the affordability crisis for 8 months. It is heartbreaking for me to say this. It is so much bigger than an affordability crisis. I actually think the worst is still to come, and Republicans are whistling past the graveyard. And I'm afraid Democrats don't even have all the answers right now. What I have seen is a despair. People worried about whether they can stay in their homes. Elderly, homeless populations growing. The food lines are getting longer. There is no longer upward mobility. Home ownership is out of reach. People are chasing rents, taking their kids out of school. Healthcare is now something that is completely out of reach. People are losing their doctors and their healthcare plans. But it's this notion, I think what we've missed in the past decade is the inability to measure the loss of upward mobility. Hope is gone. Hope is gone. And so, for instance, I skipped past Medicaid expansion. We need it in Florida. We're one of 10 states that hasn't. I'm now proposing the direct delivery of government-funded primary health care services in all 67 counties because it actually delivers health care in a way that is needed right now.
And a more cost affordable. Yes, it's more cost effective.
It is. And actually, we can thank Trump for this populist strain of just saying, let's get past insurance companies now, right? We're in a different place here. And the paradigms we're debating right now in Washington, I don't trust will solve anything. I do think Democratic governors are going to be in a place to provide relief.
And the issue is, all the stuff you talk about is solvable if somebody actually gets down to doing it. Thanks to both of you. Great to see you both here tonight, Melissa Murray and David Jolly. All right, coming up, Trump's Republican allies are desperate to keep Jack Smith from testifying about the criminal cases that he's prepared against Donald Trump. That's next. Former special counsel Jack Smith wants to testify publicly after he spent over 8 hours behind closed doors with the House Judiciary Committee defending the federal criminal charges that he brought against Donald Trump. Politico reports that in a new letter to Republican Chairman Jim Jordan, Jack Smith's lawyers said, quote, "We reiterate our request for an open and public hearing. During the investigation of President Trump, Mr. Smith steadfastly followed Justice Department policies, observed all legal requirements, and took actions based on the facts and the law. He stands by his decisions." Smith's lawyers also requested that the videotape of Smith's testimony be released in full so that he can speak to the public directly, quote, rather than through secondhand accounts, end quote. Republicans have not released a transcript of Jack Smith's deposition in which he told lawmakers that his investigation, quote, developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Our investigation also developed powerful evidence that showed President Trump willfully retained highly classified documents after he left office. He then repeatedly tried to obstruct justice to conceal his continuing retention of those documents, end quote. Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin is back with us. He was in the room for Jack Smith's closed-door testimony. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
You bet.
You know, when Jack Smith's indictments first came out, I read them as a podcast because people were very interested in them, but they're very long and they wanted to hear them in a different way. And I found when I read it, for the non-lawyers in the room, it was very easy to read. It was very straightforward. It looked solid. He's now making that case that my evidence was solid. May I please talk to the public about this?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was just a dazzling performance over the course of 8 hours, and there's really nothing that he stated privately that can't be known publicly. In fact, the public's got a right to know, and the public knows most of it. But he's been emphatic that he and the prosecutors could prove beyond a reasonable doubt every element of each offense that Donald Trump was indicted for. They could prove that he conspired to commit a fraud against the United States, that they conspired to disrupt a federal proceeding, the peaceful transfer of power, and they acted to conspire to violate the voting rights of tens of millions of Americans whose votes would have been essentially nullified if they had gotten their way and Vice President Pence had set aside electoral college votes from Michigan and Arizona and Georgia and several other states. So, I think he was there for 7 hours. He is one class act cool customer, and he just schooled the Judiciary Committee for all of that time on what prosecutors do. They act based on the facts, they apply the law to the facts, and they act completely within the rules of professional and ethical conduct. And he did that. They didn't lay a glove on him.
Well, Jim Jordan said on Fox that he answered questions. He didn't take the fifth. That said, Jim Jordan still felt that the charges were politicized. Jack Smith, in his opening statement, said the decision to bring charges against President Trump was mine, but the basis for those charges rests entirely with President Trump and his actions, as alleged in the indictments returned by grand juries in 2 different districts. If asked whether to prosecute a former president based on the same facts today, I would do so regardless of whether the president was a Republican or a Democrat, end quote. So he addressed that right off the top. He knew that that was going to be the criticism. He addressed it. It seems that Jim Jordan was unconvinced, but you say that anybody reasonable in that room would have listened to what he said and come to the same conclusion.
I mean, the Republicans were completely flummoxed and paralyzed by virtue of all the truth-telling that was going on. And his testimony is really the perfect prelude to the 5th anniversary of January 6th coming up, because he reminded everybody of what actually happened. And to attack him is essentially to buy into the big lie. Remember, Donald Trump wanted everybody to believe that he'd actually won the election, that Joe Biden won by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, and 60 different federal and state court decisions rejected every one of their fraudulent claims of electoral fraud or corruption.
Congressman, thank you for sticking around for us. We appreciate it. As always, Congressman Jamie Raskin. Tonight's Last Word is next. All right, before we go tonight, a quick note. Tomorrow's Velshi Band Book Club feature is a cultural phenomenon, a social media favorite, and a hit TV show, We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. The New York Times bestselling author and National Book Award finalist E. Lockhart joins the Velshi Band Book Club to discuss We Were Liars and her brand new novel, We Feel Apart. That's tomorrow on Velshi, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern. And that is tonight's Last Word.